This is part 9 in my series on the mechanical raid team, and this time around I'm going to be looking at the Tervigon. I kind of jumped at the opportunity to look at this boss because I don't often fight it, and the reason for that is that it most often appears in the common, uncommon, rare tiers of the guild raids, and generally for me it's just a waste to attack those bosses because my mechanical team is far better spent against tougher targets. Not only that, but also the mechanical team, in comparison to, say, a multi-hit team, doesn't perform so much better against the Tervigon that it's really worth using. There are certain bosses where the mechanical team just vastly outperforms the multi-hit team, at least the general kind of multi-hit team that a lot of people have, which revolves around Eldrion. So a chief example of that would be the Avatar of Cain, where you can't use Eldrion. Another one would be Mortarion, because of his revoltingly resilient ability. You can't really deal a lot of damage against him with multi-hitters just because of how that works with reducing damage down exponentially, so that you're only really doing 3 hits worth of damage, no matter how many hits you deal. No, that's not to say that the mechanical team is bad against the Tervigon at all. I mean, in this replay I do well over 1 million damage. It's just, when you use your mechanical team, and you're playing as part of a guild, obviously, because it's guild raids, you just have to consider prioritising and how useful it is for you to use your tokens against certain things. And generally I don't think it's worth using tokens against the Tervigon, and I think I've explained why. Especially when with a multi-hit team you can essentially surround the Tervigon with Bellators, Inceptors, and Aleph Knolls, Scarabs, and just generally give it quite a nasty time. That's, I think, one of the important things about the mechanical team when you're playing this boss is dealing with its movement. Now the Tervigon, it starts out always with a movement of 4, which is quite high, and it doesn't have the biggest footprint of a boss, so it's a 3 hex footprint. You know, the footprint goes up to 7 in size with the Avatar of Cain or Mortarion or Magnus, or the Rogaldorn tank, any other one that I might be forgetting in this moment, but this size allows it to fit in many spaces. You know, it can fit in here, anywhere up here really, and combine that with a movement of 4, and it's actually quite difficult to block the Tervigon in. And again, with a multi-hit team, it's not too much of a big deal if the boss moves around, but if the boss moves away from Exeter Rose, so he's no longer in contact with it, and all of your summons attack it in the next turn, and Rose just sitting there doing nothing, you've lost a huge amount of damage. So with the Tervigon, you kind of need to take out at least one of the Tyrannid Primes if you want to get a really good hit in against it with a mechanical team. Whereas with multi-hit teams, you don't really have to worry about the Prime, so that's another reason to maybe consider favouring letting the multi-hit teams in your guild attack the Tervigon over the anyone with a mechanical team. So I've reduced the movement. Well, I didn't reduce it. My guildmate reduced its movement down to 3, and I think 3 movement is actually quite manageable. So don't necessarily, if you're using mechanical team, have to take out both of the primes. I think taking out 1 generally will be enough to keep it under control. But you will need the right team to keep it under control. So the right team, in my opinion, is using Aleph and Aleph Scarabs, because the Scarabs can really surround the Tervigon and both stop it from moving and prevent it from summoning, potentially as well. And you really want to prevent it from summoning because it summons in 6 units, 6 Termagants via spawn Termagant's ability, so up to 6 Termagants. Depending on how boxed in it can spawn fewer than 6, but up to 6, which can really distract your Skitari if you're not careful. Skitari and your Scarabs. There is a solution to that within sort of the function of the mechanical team, though. And the solution to that is that the Tervigon has the Synaptic Backlash ability, And that means that whenever it's critted, nearby Tervigons take damage. And you might think, how is that relevant? Well, it's relevant to your summons being distracted. So what I used to do when I fought the Tervigon, back before I had such a well-developed mechanical team, was I would use Ravas. And the thing about Ravas's mechanical summons is that they don't like to stray too far from her. So I would deploy her drones, and they would hit the Tervigon in melee and trigger row, but if the Tervigon summoned its termagants and it spawned them far enough away from Ravas's drones, the drones wouldn't pursue the termagants. They'd instead stay by Ravas and continue to hit the boss in melee. And when they hit the boss in melee, that triggers Row, if Row is also in melee of the boss. And then if he crits the boss, that will then potentially kill some or all of the termagants, depending on how well spread out they are. And so if you spawn the drones in first, you can kind of give yourself an opportunity to kill all of the termagants before your Skitari start running all over the map trying to kill them. So that's quite a decent way of actually preventing your summons from getting too distracted. You can also do that with Skitari. Skitari are limited enough in their movement and needing to attack from range where they can often not reach termagants to attack them, and so they'll simply just attack the boss instead, and potentially trigger Row again, and again potentially kill all of the boss summons via Row's passive. One thing I wouldn't do is spawn the Scarabs first, because they have a very high mobility, and that means that they will always pretty much be able to reach any termagants that get spawned in. So if you spawn the Scarabs in first, they will get distracted. They won't have a chance to have another mechanical summon hit the boss, then get hit by Row, and then kill all of the termagants. Speaking of the Scarabs, the boss has the Massive Scything Talons ability, and that's a given for... There are 3 different types of Tervigon, and they all have this ability. And this means that summons take... well, anything adjacent to whatever the boss attacks will also be hit 3 times. And that means that Scarab Swarms take quite a lot of damage from this boss, and it does tend to like to stay where it can hit targets and hit any adjacent Scarab Swarms with this ability just because of how much damage it deals to them. It can very quickly tear through your Scarab Swarms if you're not keeping them topped up on health. Sometimes you can't help but let them die because you can't choose which Scarab Swarm Aleph's passive heals. And so you might want it to heal one swarm and it doesn't. It swarms a different swarm. It heals a different swarm and then a swarm dies. So it is quite a struggle to keep them alive. You may want to, in fact, manually heal them with Aleph just to keep them in the game, especially if they haven't replicated yet, because you want lots of Scarabs replicating against this boss just to keep the summons under control for a start, because if the boss is surrounded it can't summon, and also to keep the boss itself under control. That's one thing to consider, is think, is it worth it to attack the boss with Aleph when I could heal up a swarm instead? The problem with this particular Tervigon is that it has the Lethal Miasma passive ability. Lower level bosses, this might actually not do enough damage to kill a member of a Scarab Swarm, but if it is doing enough damage to kill a member of a Scarab Swarm, then it can essentially kill all but one member of a swarm per turn if it's hitting the swarm with both this Miasma and the Massive Scything Talons. The other forms of Tervigon, you don't need to worry about them so much. One of them, it can boost the range damage of the termagants it spawns, which isn't really useful, and the other one can potentially revive a termagant that gets killed adjacent to it, as long as the termagant isn't overkilled. So again, that's not really a very important ability. But this one, it can actually affect the flow of battle quite a bit, and it means that you have to be very careful with your Scarab Swarms, because if they take a hit from this miasma at the start of the turn and then massive scything talons and you don't heal them at the start of the next turn, the miasma will finish them off. It'll very quickly sort of choose through scarab swarms. In terms of other abilities, this catalyst, I wouldn't consider that too important because generally you'll be wanting to kill the termagants as fast as possible, and it can't use this ability in the same turn that it kills that it spawns the termagants in. So by the time it has the ability to use this ability on termagants, they should hopefully all be dead anyway. Aside from that, the termagants dealing greater damage, they're not able to attack when they're spawned in, so again, this isn't particularly important to the flow of the battle. That's really it as far as the abilities of the boss go, so now I will get into the fight itself. Just as a general rule, so there's this cliff here that you have to go around, so generally what I'll do is I'll have flying units start around here. I had Actus start here, so that he can simply just fly over the cliff. And that you can make use of his flying trait to stop him from being obstructed. Where if Eldryon is here, he'd be obstructed from trying to move. So I have Eldryon here, Ro here, and Tan here. I could have a flying unit here so they could move where Tan is, so they could move onto this hex, but it wasn't really that important to me. However, I did want to make sure that I could get these two moved up here. And because of the boss's massive Scything Talons ability, it does like to engage in melee so that it can deal those extra hits to any targets adjacent to its initial target. So by grouping Eldryon and Ro together here, I'm kind of increasing the chances of it coming up onto this area and attacking, which is sort of what I want it to do. Now, this boss's behaviour is not guaranteed. It can summon in the first turn, or it can summon in the second turn. It'll always do one of the two, unless you completely surround it. If it does summon, you then have 3 turns before it will summon again. So if it summons in the first round, then the next time it's able to summon is in the penultimate round. If it summons in the second round, then it'll be able to summon in the final round. So obviously with a Ro team, you want to have Ro's active online and sort of going in the last couple of rounds when you've got all of your summons out and you can really deal a lot of damage. So ideally at that point you'll have the boss fully surrounded. So what I'm doing now is preparing to surround the boss. So I have Actus in melee, Tan here, so I know Tan will spawn a Skitarius here, and Aleph, when she spawns her Scarabs, will spawn 1 swarm here and 1 swarm here. So when the boss summons in, it has to kind of shoot its summons outwards through a gap adjacent to it, and the only places it'll be able to shoot them out is here. And I have Ro here. Is it advisable to have Ro here? It's debatable, because I'll have summons moving in to attack the boss's summons, and that might sort of draw Ro away from the boss, out of melee with it, and he might lose out on some potential damage in the next turn. But I'll have so few summons out that the amount of potential damage I might miss out on from Ro not being adjacent to the boss when a summon attacks it is extremely low in the grand scheme of things, and I'm expecting all of my summons really to be distracted by the boss's Termagant summons anyway. I have Eldryon here because high ground bonus is not important. He doesn't deal any damage, he is simply here to buff. Also, if I have him standing up on the high ground, he could block where the Skitari want to stand. So I don't want him blocking the Skitari. Also, because I know the boss is going to be summoning sort of in this area of the map, if I put Eldryon here, the chances are he's going to have Doom on at least 1 or 2 of them, which is good for me, because it means that my summons will be able to take them out quicker, potentially overkill them, which will increase the chances of others of the summons then fleeing, and just generally be less of a distraction for my summons. Another thing to note as well is that the active of the Forge Fiend, its damage is boosted by Doom. So even though my Forge Fiend has a very low level active ability, as long as Doom is affecting a Termagant, it will do a huge amount of additional damage and easily kill a Termagant. So it's actually fairly useful to have the Forge Fiend in this battle. Galatian is still a better choice overall, but if you don't have Galatian like me built in any way, then the next best bet in my eyes is the Forge Fiends, just because of how quickly you can clear out the boss's summons with it. If you've upgraded your Forge Fiend so it can kill the Termagants in one attack without the help of Doom, that's fine, but just a little hint, you can use Eldryon to help it along a bit in terms of the damage it does. So that's everything now set up for the boss's summon, as far as I'm concerned. Another reason to have Eldryon here is that ultimately I want to stop the boss moving away from Ro into this sort of area of the map, because I don't want to have to reposition Ro and miss out on any damage that he could be doing. So I want to move Eldryon into this area of the map here, just to block off these hexes for the boss to move on to. So get Skitari out. And again, Tan's rules of summoning his Skitari. He'll go clockwise from the 12 o'clock position, so the 12 o'clock position is blocked, so the first one is spawned here, and that nicely seals off this little gap in in the shell of sorts surrounding the Tervigon. Now I'll build up that shell a bit more by spawning in the scarabs. Now, as far as using the passive of the Forge Fiend goes, I'm not entirely sure if this is true, but I believe that the boss does not like to move on to flaming hexes, so I do try and use the passive to control it and stop it from moving. I can't guarantee if this works, but this is just me attempting to stop it from moving over here. That being said, I'm not worried about it moving in the next turn, because whenever it summons, it stays still. So this is fine having the gap here, because it's not going to move. As we'll see, it's going to summon. We've got quite a weird distribution of summons. So you can see here that this Guitarist did not shoot at any of the Termagants, it instead shot the boss. And Ro hit it with his passive as a result of that. Now that didn't score a crit, but you can see how that could have scored a crit and potentially killed any Termagants that were in this sort of area, which means that I then wouldn't have to finish them off. However, there's only one Termagant left, and it's being doomed, so I just kill it with the Forge Fiend's active. And then move Ro back up so he has the high ground. And I'll start rebuilding that shell around the boss. And getting my Skitari out, of course. Now by moving Eldryon here, I'm preventing the boss from moving into this set of 3 hexes, or here, or here. So there's just this area that it can now move into with its movement of 3. If so both of its primes reduce its movement by 1 when they're killed. So if both of its primes have been killed at this point, it wouldn't actually be able to move anywhere at all, but because it has a movement of 3, it could still potentially move into this area. Again, it's on fire, so if I'm right about it not wanting to move on to flames, then I don't need to move Aleph to block this area off, but I'm not 100% certain on this, and I wasn't willing to risk the hit to my damage output to potentially let it move. So I decided to just ensure that the boss couldn't move anywhere and move Aleph to this position. Another benefit of doing that was that I could heal up this Scarab Swarm, and these Scarab Swarms do need to be kept healed up because this boss is quite good at finishing them off. So the boss has nowhere to move. It attacks Actus because it can hit 2 targets adjacent to Actus with its massive scything talons, which includes a scarab swarm, so that makes the boss very happy because it does like to reduce the health of the targets it hits by a great deal. So now I've moved Aleph back into melee with the boss, and I know that because of how the boss likes to kill targets, it's going to hit Aleph in the next turn because this Scarab Swarm will have been hit by its miasma at the start of the turn, reducing it to 3 members, and then the massive scything talons would finish it off. I definitely don't want this Scarab Swarm to die because it's one that can replicate, and I want the Scarab Swarms to start properly surrounding the boss, so I don't have to worry about it summoning a second time. And get my last Skitarius out of Tan, so I have 4 Skitari out now. Obviously I healed with Actus first, so that I can now switch to Conqueror mode and get 4 extra hits in. So I've healed up that Scarab Swarm for the reasons I said. I don't want it to die, and hopefully it will replicate in the next turn so I don't have to worry about it anymore. And again, just as a precaution, I'm going to put fire in this area to hopefully stop the boss from moving, although I don't think it would be tempted to anyway because it can hit these 2 Scarab Swarms here with its massive scything talons if it hits Aleph in melee. So I believe that no matter what, it should want to stay where it is anyway, just in terms of doing the most damage. Also, I believe bosses that have sort of an aura, this is not, I don't know this for sure, but this is the general impression I seem to get from Mortarion and the Tervigons with the lethal miasma ability, is that they like to stay in areas where they can hit the most units possible with their sort of damaging aura. So if it stays in the middle of all of my summons and characters here, it can hit a lot of them with miasma. So I think that would make it favour staying in this position a lot more than trying to move over here and like just hit a single Scarab Swarm in melee. That doesn't seem like it would be very useful in terms of the boss thinking, oh, I want to damage a lot of things. So there we go, like I said, it's trying to deal as much damage as possible, and it sees it can reduce those 2 swarms to 20% health. And so it attacks Aleph to hit them with the massive scything talons. And I'm in a bit of a bind here now, because I still don't have the boss fully surrounded. And unfortunately I didn't have any Scarab Swarms move in after this Skitarius moved. I foresee a bit of a problem here. I don't think I've ever seen the boss, the Tervigon, summon just a single Termagant. I might be wrong, but I think it can summon 2 or more, but not 1. I'm just seeing a slight problem here, is that if it summons, it will summon a Termagant here and a Termagant here. And if one of my mechanical summons attacks this summon here first, Ro will hit it with his passive and move into its place, and then if another summon attacks the summon that's here, Ro will attack it with his passive and move into its place, at which point he'll no longer be in melee with the boss. I definitely don't want that to happen, so what I do is this. Well, first of all I use Ro's active because there's only 2 turns left, so it'd be a waste to use it any later than this. I use Actus's active there to heal this Scarab Swarm, because if it had been left the way it was, so say I attacked with Aleph first before I healed with Actus, Aleph could potentially heal this Scarab Swarm with his passive, then this Scarab Swarm would stay with just 1 member left, and Actus using his active here wouldn't help it at all. But if I use Actus's active here first, it will heal this Scarab Swarm up, and then when Aleph attacks afterwards and her passive kicks in, the only thing that it can heal is this Scarab Swarm. So by using Actus's heal first, I can guarantee that this swarm gets healed up to full health, and it won't be killed by the Tervigon, its miasma, at the beginning of the next turn. So I use Actus's heal, and now I move Tan here. So if the boss does summon, it can only summon into this hole, and that means that Ro can't be sort of dragged away out of melee with the boss now, because he's not adjacent to any summons that could get spawned in. So someone gets spawned here, the Skitaris shoots it and it dies, that's the end of that. There's no chance of Ro going anywhere. Now, I think that's worth sacrificing an extra hit from a Skitarius, being triggered by Conqueror mode, to have that peace of mind knowing that Ro is not going to get dragged away from the boss. And finally attack with Aleph, as I said, and Aleph's passive heals this swarm, which is what I wanted. In the boss's turn, the area around it is so restricted that it doesn't even summon. Because I guess as far as the boss can see, there's no point summoning where you only get one Termagant spawned in, when it could instead attack and destroy that Scarab Swarm.